Welcome to AP European History's first lecture. This is chapter 12, and it is, of course, over the Renaissance, recovery and rebirth, the age of the Renaissance. And when we talk about recovery, we are talking about recovery from the disastrous 14th century to 1300s, which saw financial issues, some economic issues, but most importantly, of course, the middle of the century saw the Black Death, this huge economic calamity and social calamity that devastated Europe. And so this is kind of the pickup after that. This is Europe getting back on its feet. Here are some focus questions. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can pause this so that you can see these focus questions. They're very important, because if you can answer these questions, then you get it. You get this chapter and you're ready. Okay? So at the end of this, you should be able to answer these focus questions. Okay? So, all right, starting off, we get a little bit of art form here. Michelangelo's creation on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That is Adam receiving the divine spark from God. Renaissance art. And the Renaissance is going to be about a lot more than just art, but it certainly has, it's well known for its art. It literally means rebirth, which is a French term. It's a rebirth speaking of the Greco-Roman heritage. And it's a transition. We see it as a transition from medieval to modern times. It's that little buffer zone between the two. It's a break from medieval Europe, which is pre-12th century Europe. This was a fragmented feudal society with manor systems and kings and lords and nobles and vassals and all that stuff. That was an agricultural economy in medieval Europe. And it was church dominated. Church dominated thought. It dominated the culture for 1,000 years. It's the premier institution in the Middle Ages. The Renaissance is going to be an urban movement. It's going to be an upper class movement. And that's why it's going to take place in Italy. All right, so we're going to get a few slides here of medieval art. And you can see it. That one's a little bland, but these are fine. That's okay. What we're going to see, though, as we get into Renaissance art is just them really taking it to the next level. Some argue over whether or not the Renaissance artworks are the greatest the world has ever seen. Here, see some Gothic-style reliefs. The Cathedral of Notre Dame, which sadly just burnt down a few months ago. All right, now here is a portrait of Renaissance art. And the Renaissance is an individual movement. It's a humanistic movement. It celebrates people. It celebrates human dignity and beauty. Okay. Won't let me. All right. Again, major features of the Renaissance, the work and legacy of Jakob Burckhardt up here. He's the first guy who really coins the term Renaissance, the first historian who says that it was a different time period from the Middle Ages, and he does this in the mid-19th century, around 1860. So he's the reason we have the term Renaissance and the idea that this is something different from the Middle Ages. But the major features of the Renaissance, like I said, urban. Remember that very much. Urban, commercial capitalist economy drives this. It's recovery from that 14th century, rebirth of Greco-Roman culture. You see great emphasis on individual ability and human accomplishments, that human beings are incredible. You also see political centralization and national feelings. It's in this time period that we're going to see states, view themselves as nation states. We are France, we are Spain, we are England. Secularism is a major, major part of the Renaissance. You have to know that. And of course, secular means worldly or non-religious. Secularism grew as wealth led to the enjoyment of earthly things. And we get economic recovery. Basically what you have now, Italy is the home of the Renaissance. But in this time period, they're going to have a rival, an economic rival. And that's the Hanseatic League, or the Hansa. And that's North German monopoly league here. It's like a giant guild, a guild of guilds, if you will. About 1500, 80 North German cities belonged to the Hanseatic League, which created its own armies. It established commercial settlements in England and Northern Europe, and its main city was Lubeck. That means that the Italian cities are going to lose their economic supremacy, and that's going to be damaging to them. The Renaissance is interesting because while it starts in Italy, you're going to see Italy doesn't keep the power. They will not be the power in the 1500s. That's going to be Spain, and it's going to be France for the most part, and moving towards England. Now, there are a lot of industries, old and new, amongst these two. Textiles, you have the new printing, mining, and metallurgy, and you have the old school wool industry that was in Florence, Italy. Banking, when we talk about banking, we talk about the Medici family in Florence, Italy. And they were one of the greatest banks in all of Europe. We're going to see their influence on both the Republic of Florence and the world itself. Here's a picture of Lubeck and the Hanseatic League here. Again, they're military. They're very powerful. They have a military and everything. All right, some social changes in the Renaissance. Now, the nobility make up 2 to 3% of the total population here in Europe. And we get some ideals of people like Castellani, who writes the Book of the Courtier. And in that, you're going to kind of see how his idea of a noble differs from, say, Machiavelli's idea of a noble or a prince. And in the Book of Courtier, he really has 3 main ideas on how a noble should act. The first of those is that a noble should have impeccable character, and grace. The second idea is that nobles should cultivate achievements, that they should manage great things. And third, that the nobles should follow a standard of conduct, that they have virtue. Basically, that they should be really, really good people, should be better than the average person. Now, peasants and townspeople make up 85 to 90% of the population. And in the Renaissance time period, you see a massive decline in manorialism, the manor system where you churned your own butter and you shoed your own horses and everything was self-sufficient. You also get a decline of serfdom. Now, those are direct consequences of the Black Death because there's such a huge loss of labor that those systems are going to break down. And it becomes easier just simply for these nobles to pay people to come work the land. Now, in the cities, you're looking at about a 6 to 7% of the population kind of living in cities. And you have a hierarchy in these urban areas. And we're mostly talking about Italy here because there are not many cities or what we would recognize as cities in other parts of Europe, which is very rural. The richest people in these cities are called patricians. And those just below them are the petty burghers. And below them you have shopkeepers and artisans and guild masters. Below them you have guildsmen, people belonging to the guild, just skilled workers basically. Then you have regular workers. These are probably more of the form of unskilled workers versus the skilled workers of guildsmen. And then on the bottom, you have the unemployed. And some of these cities had major issues with unemployment, such as Florence, which had some out of 100,000 people at one time supposedly had around 17,000 beggars, basically unemployed. So it was a major issue. There is slavery in the Renaissance period. Doesn't talk about it here. Many of the slaves you should put down were women. Some of them, of course, were turned into concubines, serving the men that bought them, basically. Most of the slaves came from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. And at one point, there were some slaves coming in from Africa as well. But slavery in Italy is a little bit different than slavery, say, in the New World in the Americas. All right, family marriage in Renaissance Italy. Remember, Renaissance is upper level, upper crust. So amongst the elite, marriages tended to be arranged, and they did this to strengthen business or family ties, basically to keep their families rich or in the hopes of making their families richer. And the dowry is very important to this. A man would marry off his daughter. He's got to basically, with her is going to come her dowry, her money. And he is trying to get someone from a better family, if he can, to accept that dowry. So these families with boys are looking at prospective women with their dowries, and they're kind of measuring up, what dowry can I get best for my son? And so it's kind of this weird political arrangement. And so, of course, you're not going to be marrying for love, and there's some consequences to that. Now, the father husband is the head of the family in Italy, without a doubt. But in these upper crust families, the wife is going to manage the household. And rich women have more babies. And there's a couple reasons for this that are pretty interesting. So, a rich woman can afford to have a wet nurse, a woman who would feed the baby breast milk. And so, when a woman stops breastfeeding, it's like her body tells her that she's ready to have more children. So common women, they would have to breastfeed their babies to feed them themselves, and that would mean that they would have to go longer before they could get pregnant again. So rich people, they can have their women can have basically a child once a year if they want, and they have large numbers because there is a 50% mortality rate amongst children in this time period, from birth to the age of 20. So half of your children will die. It's a staggering number. And they want to ensure a male heir to continue on the family business and the money and all that stuff. So they want to have a lot of babies. And so the rich women are almost just baby factories, really. It's pretty wild. Um, Again, children right there, tremendous dangers for not only the children, but for the women. A lot of women die in childbirth as well. One rich guy, he had 3 out of his 4 wives died in labor, and one of them died after giving him his 15th child. So pretty dangerous back then without modern medicine. Sexual norms, because of these arranged marriages, it was typical to see older males being married off to younger females. You also saw extramarital relationships. Of course, it's double standard. It's acceptable for the men and necessary evil that they visit prostitutes and stuff like that and have mistresses. Whereas, depending on how powerful your husband is, you could be executed for sleeping around on your husband. So for a woman, it was a dangerous game they would play. Prostitution became this necessary vice that they basically had prostitution houses, and prostitutes were identified, but they were allowed. It wasn't illegal because it was viewed as a necessary evil, a necessary vice. All right. Households, typically extended household of parents, children, and servants. Also, sometimes sisters that were unwed would be part of your home, and grandparents, if they lived long enough, could be part of your home. It just depended. Marriage ceremonies, very similar to what we have now. Exchange of vows. You have the ring being put on the finger by the bridegroom. The ring's a sign of affection and the symbol of the union of the two families. And then you see a painting here that shows you, just like us, it's a big deal. It's a big celebration when families marry, and rich people take it to the next level. All right. Come on. Okay, now this is very important. You have to know, we're going to memorize the 5 major states of Italy. Now, in the north, you really have 2. The Duchy of Milan, which was ruled by 2 different ruling families, Visconti for a while, and then the Forza family. Now, the theme for them is that they were very centralized, meaning that they ran everything, that the rulers, the princes there, ruled everything. They had high taxation, but they made that work. Now, another northern power was Venice, and they're very wealthy due to their maritime trade. And later on down here, we'll get a map, and you'll kind of be able to see that. Now, Venice's power frightened Milan and a central Italian power called Florence, and so you'll see them team up against them. The Republic of Florence was only a republic on the surface, in name only. In reality, the de facto rulers were the Medici family. Cosimo de' Medici is the guy who started his family controlling it. Remember, they're bankers, they're rich, and they prefer to rule behind the scenes. In Florence, you saw a lot of gross inequality. The rich are rich and the poor are poor. A lot of crime and disease because, again, you have a big gap income gap. You also have in the central areas the papal states. Papal, root of that being pope. Many of these states become independent, more independent, after the Avignon papacy and something called the Great Schism. Now, the Avignon papacy, you had a French pope. So you have a cardinal from France raised to pope. He prefers it back in Avignon, and he moves his court there and away from the traditional center there in Rome. That irks some people. And there's a Game of Thrones going on, basically. You got power plays. And so in Italy, they raise another pope. And so now you have two popes and you have an issue. And the church has a schism, a divide. Who do we support? This pope or the original pope or this new pope? The pope who doesn't seem to want anything to do with us and goes to France, or this new guy? And eventually they even get a third pope at one time. It gets pretty wild. Okay, so that will kind of weaken their states a little bit. And the last of the five kingdoms that you have to know is the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Naples. It's easily the poorest of the five regions. It's not run very well. The nobles are pretty corrupt there, and it eventually really gets controlled by Spain for a while there. All right. Now, there are also some other independent city-states that are smaller. They're independent of the big five, and they're controlled by powerful ruling families, such as Urbino, which is one of these places. And we'll talk about its rulers here in just a second. The role of women in these areas, they were very important in the small Renaissance courts. A woman had to be politically savvy. She was educated. The husband needed her to help him out. Remember, they're the small dogs surrounded by big dogs. One of the most notable, of course, was Isabella d'Este, who married Francesco Gonzaga, who was the Marquis of a independent city-state called Mantua. And at times, she was even called the First Lady of the World. She had an incredibly brilliant mind. She was criticized by other men who didn't like the fact that she was so intelligent. She roasted them all, though. She was. You did not want to get into an intellectual debate with this woman. She was just smarter than 99% of the people out there. Oh, come on. All right. My clicker is not working here very good, so bear with me. So let's get that map we were talking about. All right, so very important that you kind of get this map in your mind. There's Milan and Venice, the two northern areas. And then you see a number. There's Mantua, where Isabella d'Este would have come from. And you see this. You have these smaller independent states. Then you have Florence here with the Medici family, the banking center. You have the papal states, so the Pope in Rome, and these are lands. There's Urbino, a city-state that tries to be independent of the Pope. And then down here, the weaker kingdom of Naples. Now, Venice has access to the Adriatic Sea, and so they become this great maritime power. And so you'll see these two kind of team up against them. All right, here are the Duke and Duchess of Urbino, Federico de Montefeltro, and his wife, Sforza. So you have two powerful families here that unite. I like their story. They're neat. Montefeltro is basically a despot, meaning he has all the power. But he's a guy, they talk about how he can walk in the streets without any kind of bodyguards because he's beloved of the people, because he treats the people good. And he relies on his wife tremendously, because there are times when he is out of town working for the betterment of his city-state, and she runs things in his absence. So he gives her a lot of authority. And again, it is interesting that he doesn't need protection from the people. Even though he rules absolutely, he does not let it corrupt him. So he's an interesting story. All right. You have all these Italian states. You've got a lot of warfare. These city-states are jockeying for position. This fragmentation gives rise to a balance of power concept, which is very important. In Italy is a microcosm of Europe as a whole. So Europe as a whole doesn't want any one country to have all the power. Think Napoleon. When Napoleon rises up and starts conquering too many places, then the rest of Europe rises up to put him down. Well, it's kind of how it is in Italy. They don't want Venice to have too much power. They don't want to have Florence to have too much power. There needs to be a balance of power spread out. Now, this led to an alliance system where you would see Milan, Florence, and Naples, the weaker Naples to the south, tend to team up against Venice and the Papal States. But eventually you would see the incursion of France and Spain also fighting within Italy. All right. Again, that fragmentation does make them weaker and more prone to getting taken over by the powerhouses of France and Spain. All right. Florence and Naples agreed to attack Milan to acquire territory. So again, you're talking about these agreements, and we're in a whole here. We're talking about French invasions that occur, for about 30 years here. The Milanese despot, meaning basically the ruler, Lodovico il Moro asked France for help, and France agrees. That's a mistake. And the French king Charles VIII stormed through Italy in hopes of weakening Naples, the southern area, which was a former French territory. He is later driven out. However, Charles takes over Florence without resistance, and Piero de' Medici, of the ruling family there, or the power behind the Republic, tries to appease him by handing him Pisa. And during all this, a Dominican friar named Savanara says this invasion is just a just punishment from God for the sins of the Florentine people. He himself rules Florence for 4 years before being executed. So you invite the French in, it's not very smart. They're going to take over what they want to take over because they're a greater power in this time period. And France is more united. They see themselves as a united force. Okay? Now, two very important people here. One is, and this again, still during the French invasions, Pope Alexander VI. He's the most corrupt pope in papal history. He is a member of the Borgia family. He has illegitimate children. He is building huge palaces. He's very, very, very corrupt. He is not pious in any way. And at the same time, you have King Louis XII of France, who was Charles's successor. So he's going to come after Charles VIII. He allies with this corrupt pope and ends up taking Milan and part of the Naples and then part of the Papal States. Ludovico dies in a French prison, and France would end up controlling much of Italy, which we'll kind of see a trend. Remember that Napoleon will come into Italy later on as well. The Borgia family established powerful ties to France and took over Romagna. All right, now, Alexander's successor was also a pope you have to know. And his name was Pope Julius II, and you remember him as the warrior pope. He is a military general as well as a pope, and he drives the French out once again, and he stands up against the Borgia family. He is the ultimate in the Renaissance papacy. He is the pope of the Renaissance. He had military and political power on an enormous scale. But people were shocked by his secular papacy. That the Pope should be more of a stand-aside kind of guy instead of leading armies. Humanist, which is this new movement in this time period, also criticized his papacy. Now, the next French king was King Francis I, and he embarks on the third French invasion. Again, there are riches to be had in Italy. They're fragmented. It's easier to pick them off. Julius allies with Spain, Venice, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Swiss to expel the French from Italy. So the warrior pope is going to get some allies, and he's going to be able to push the French out. And that works because they don't want France to become too powerful. The balance of power in Europe. This leads to an Italian political decline and the Habsburg Values, which is Spanish and French families, wars of the first half of the 16th century. And France is going to lose them all. So that's going to help lead to Spain being the leading power of the 1500s. Now, you also in this time period get the birth of modern diplomacy. Resident agents or ambassadors who are agents of their state. In the medieval time period, an ambassador represented sort of all of Christendom. They didn't really think of themselves as a representation of France or England or something like that, but of the whole. But in this time period, if you are an ambassador of Venice, you are trying to make things better for Venice. That is your goal. It is the same diplomacy that we use today. An American diplomat is trying to advance America's causes and wishes. Machiavelli, this famous guy, we see him. He comes in. He's very affected by the politics that's going on in Italy. At one time, he's exiled from Italy, and after that he kind of writes his book called The Prince. And The Prince talks about how the goals of a prince is for the acquisition of territory, the maintenance of that territory, and expansion of political power. He sees, he believes himself more of a realist, a pragmatist. That Castiglione's ideas on nobles, his ideals, those three ideals we talked about earlier, aren't very realistic, and that people are kind of bad and they'll stab you in the back if you let them. He has famous quotes like, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, and that it's better to be feared than loved. And we'll examine him in much more detail in class. There's a picture of Machiavelli. Now, political ideas stemmed from his study of ancient Rome and his preoccupation with Italy's political problems. And again, the Italian city-states were no match for these powerful national monarchies like Spain and France. Princes cannot act Christian and retain power, according to Machiavelli, because human nature is corrupt and selfish. And it's very clear from reading his book that the ends justify the means. He says in there that you should not just kill for no reason, but when there is reason, you must be able to kill. You have to have people fear you. They can't hate you, but they must fear you. A little chronology for the Duchy of Milan. Two separate families here, the Viscontis and the Sforzas. And then you have a little of the same here. In Florence, you have Cosimo de Medici, who starts the whole shebang, and then Lorenzo, and then you get this piece of Lodi for a little bit. And then the French begin invading, and it ends with the sack of Rome. All right, the emergence of humanism. You have to know humanism. Based on Greco-Roman literature, without a doubt, Petrarch is the supposed father of humanism. He comes. You can see his dates are just before the Renaissance really kicks off. They also, in 15th century Italy, they come up with the idea of civic humanism, especially in Florence, this so-called republic, using Cicero as a model. Basically, what civic humanism is, you need to write this, is that a person does things to advance their state. They have civic pride. They have civic duty. I go out and get a better education so that I can help my city-state become better. There's growing interest in the Greek civilization. They're becoming fascinated with the Greeks. And you see some humanist consciousness there and stuff, just more in-depth humanism. It is the study of Greek and Latin classics. And the ancient church fathers in hopes of reviving worthy ancient values. They're trying to fix society, really. They advocate liberal arts like grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, politics, and philosophy to celebrate the dignity of humankind and prepare for life of virtuous action, to be great. Italian humanists searched out manuscript collections, making volumes of Greek and Latin learning available to scholars. And that's important because they make it where scholars, this is the thing to do, is to go read the Greeks and the Romans and get some of their fantastic ideas. Here is Francesco Petrarch, father of humanism. He celebrated ancient Rome. He writes these poems and love sonnets. However, he does not like scholasticism, which was Aristotle's approach to learning. He craved a return to the classics of ancient Rome. And he had both religious and secular ideas. It's sort of like you can be a Christian and still believe that our schools in America don't need to be teaching religion to the students. Okay, so he kind of lives in both worlds here. Another humanist, Dante Alighieri, who rewrites these famous Roman works, Vita Nuova and the Divine Comedy, in vernacular Italian, not Latin, so that the common people can read it. He too is both religious and secular. And he puts forth the first appreciation of vernacular, the common language of an area, as a universal tool of culture and education, that we can educate more people if we do it in their native tongue. He's also known as the father of the Italian language, along with Petrarch as well. Boccaccio was one of Petrarch's students, and he's going to write this, the Decameron, 100 Tales, often funny, bawdy, sexual economic misconduct during the plague. And he has a sympathetic look at human behavior. Now, there are some education goals and reforms: mastery of ancient languages such as Latin and Greek, innovative educators. You see the discover new sources of historical information. They start going back and looking for records that are not tainted by the church. They want secular information and secular scholars. That becomes a big goal. Wisdom eloquently spoken, knowledge of the good, and ability to make others do good. And the idea that learning ennobles people, that we are better when we are educated. The ideal Renaissance man is a master of many crafts. He's the scientist, and he's the artist, he's the thinker, he's the philosopher, he's all these things. Now, humanism and philosophy play a big role in the Renaissance. We see Plato's dialogues being translated into Italian. We see a synthesis of Christianity and Platonism, so Plato's ideas and Christianity being pushed together. We see all of that. Some of the people are trying to make the ancient Greeks and Romans fit into the Christian church, and some are not. There's a break. You get something called Hermeticism, a new view of humankind as a divine creative power, and that basically that God put this spark in each one of us, and that we are incredibly amazing creatures, and that we don't give ourselves enough credit. So this humanism, this Hermeticism, is that we are very truly special. Not just a secular movement, also had strong spiritual component. Like I said, this sort of divine spark. All right, education, liberal studies, history, moral philosophy, eloquence, letters, poetry, mathematics, astronomy, and music are things that they found important. And modern day historians actually debate was there a Renaissance for women? Nagarala and Saretta are both instances that you can see that women had power in upper classes, that there was some power. They were still second-class citizens, however, is the other side of the argument. And it's an interesting one. We'll look at it a little bit closer in class. Let's see. Impact of printing. Johann Gutenberg, you know that name from AP World. Movable type. He uses vernacular, and he uses the movable type to print the first German Bible, and it's a big hit. It's going to kick off an important age. Here we see some more Renaissance art. Some dark art here. Judith slaying, I think, her husband in this, who has done bad things. All right. Raphael's famous The School of Athens, and it's, Plato and Aristotle here, and you got Pythagoras over here showing off his Pythagorean theorem and stuff. So you have, a painting of all these bright minds. Realism and expression. In Renaissance art, you will see the first naked people since classical times. And when the church had power over Europe, you would not see naked scenes are a no-no. Perspective is a major change and rise in art in Renaissance. First use of linear perspective. Classicism, Greco-Roman influence, of course, that it's secular, it's non-religious. That's humanism, that it's grounded in the idea that we are special beings. A lot of symmetry and balance. And here's the classical pose of the Medici Venus. One of the slides have been moved around. Let's see. We have an issue. All right. Pardon me. I don't know how that happened. So let's go back and find it. Where are we? Okay. So number 4, emphasis on individualism. Again, you saw this unique ruling of these people here. You also get geometrical arrangement of the figures. So there's like math involved in the paintings. You get light and shadowing used for a purpose. And these artists become celebrities. They become the rock stars of their time. Art in early Renaissance, new realism, imitation of nature, basically. Perspective and organization, movement and anatomical structure. You're going to have paintings where people are moving in them. We're structurally them anatomically correct. Now, as you know, here's a big name you need to know: Donatello, who gives he's the earlier than the other three Ninja Turtles, if you will, the other three main Renaissance men we know and talk about. Brunelleschi, he redesigns the Church of San Lorenzo, so it's architecture as well in the Renaissance. Now, artists used to be just viewed as other artisans. You start out as an apprentice, you could become a master artist, and you could join an artist guild. But as they become to depend on commissions for projects, they needed wealthy patrons. And these wealthy patrons began paying them more and more money. And so by 1500, these artistic geniuses and Renaissance men are, hanging out in rich circles. They became wealthier. They're seen as equal to the elites. They're special. As philosophers, they also help spur new intellectual theories in the arts and sciences. And again, you can look at these paintings in more detail by pushing the pause button. For the sake of brevity and keeping this short as possible, we'll not spend a lot of time on them. Raphael here with the Madonna and Child. Here is Donatello's David, which is not to be mistaken for Michelangelo's David, which comes a little bit later in the High Renaissance, which is a little better art, actually. Now, that's pretty cool here. Also Donatello, Mary Magdalene. There is the dome of the Duomo. And again, you see architecture, the interior of San Lorenzo. And the Medici family, they spend a lot of money to beautify their area. Now, the artistic high Renaissance I mentioned earlier, the mastery of scientific observation of nature, and artists became individually expressive and paint in their own manner. They have these mannerisms. That's Da Vinci work. That's Raphael work. Da Vinci's famous for several: Last Supper, Mona Lisa. Raphael is famous for the School of Athens, which we saw earlier. Michelangelo, very well known for his Sistine Chapel masterpiece, Beauty is Divine, and of course his sculpture of David. Bramante, also another Renaissance man, not quite as well known as the others. Last Supper here. The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci as well. Here's Raphael's School of Athens. And again, you got all these different people, famous Romans and Greeks that he's put in here. Michelangelo's David, which is one of my favorites. It's awesome. And also one of my favorites, Michelangelo's the Pieta. Exquisite detail here. They take the human form. In the High Renaissance, they take the human form and romanticize it just a little bit. They idealize it like the Greeks would have. Here's a scene from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. We'll look at the Sistine Chapel. It's incredible artwork in there. And a little map. We won't worry about that one right now. Now, the Northern Renaissance is different because they live in a different world. Italy is this urban area with these competing city-states. And so it was its change was inspired by humanism, emphasis on the revival of values of classical antiquity because the Greeks and Romans were there. And their human form was their main form of expression. In Northern Europe, you need to know that the change was driven by religious reform. It's against the Catholic Church. The return to Christian values, the revolt against the authority of the church. More religious art is emotional. Great attention to detail was the main form of expression and beauty. And we're going to see some incredible attention to detail in some paintings here in just a little bit. The invention of the printing press in Germany basically makes the Reformation possible. The details, its tendency is towards realism and naturalism and less emphasis on the classical idea. I kind of equate it to this. The Greeks their art was idealized. It was about grace and beauty. The Romans' art was about functionality. So their art was more realistic. So the Northern Renaissance art was more like the Roman art, and the Italian art was more like the Greek art. They had interest in landscapes in the North, more emphasis on middle class and peasant life because they had more there. Details of domestic interiors, great skill in portraits. And we'll talk about that. You also get an artistic renaissance, which is pretty cool. Guillaume Dufay changed the composition of Catholic Mass by changing music itself. He used secular tunes instead of the Gregorian chants that had dominated Mass for so long. And music's going to make its move from the church into the secular world. And you had these things called the madrigals, which are basically a poem set to music in the 14th century Italian courts, and they become a big deal. They were done in vernacular, and they were usually about love. So it's sort of like country music, I guess. You know, these ballads, these troubadours. All right, Northern painters such as this painter. So here we're going to show you how much detail they are. So here's the painting. Now here's the painting a little bit closer. And if we keep looking, look on that back wall. So this person has painted, they made the painting, and in the back wall there's a mirror. And in that mirror is the backs of the people that they painted. It's incredible. Very good. Again, attention to detail, religious. Here, Dürer has made a self-portrait that presents himself as Christ-like. Van Eyck, detail, landscapes. Now here's another one that's detailed. We're going to look at this right here, the image off of this looking glass. Look at that. That's incredible. All right. Now the Renaissance is, remember, it's age of recovery. We're getting over the Black Death. And monarchies of France, Spain, and England are trying to make themselves stronger. And remember, there's that new world over there. Discovery of the new world leads to competition. So the characteristics of the Renaissance give rise to something called new monarchies. These monarchies are trying to expand and centralize their power. They're trying to control their nobles. They also want to control the church, and they're going to do a decent job of that. They have high expectations of loyalty from their subjects, and they also gain the power of taxation from the nobles and from the church. So the kings will wield a lot of power. You're basically looking at the beginnings of absolute monarchy. So here's your map. The growth of French monarchy. Basically, after the 100 Years' War between France and England, the French, even though they have some issues following it because it made it tough on them because wars are expensive, they have a feeling of Frenchness, basically. We are the French. They are the English. And it helps lead to the nation-state idea. The Estates General, which is the parliamentary group of France, lose power to the king. In this case, we get King Louis XI, known as the Spider, for being devious and cunning. He saw territorial expansion and royal control, and he asked for the power to tax people directly and got that from the Estates General, and they never get it back. So they give a lot of power to the French kings from that point on. And French kings will rule absolutely, much more so than most of the other countries. In England, they have a civil war that helps lead to the new monarchies. You get the War of the Roses, as it was known, between the powerful families of the Lancasters and the Yorks in the mid-1400s. You also saw the administrative and financial reforms of Henry VII, who was the first Tudor king. He tried to reduce internal dissension, because he's done with these civil wars, and ended the practice of nobles having their own armies. If they don't have their own armies, then it's going to be harder for them to fight each other. He relied on trusted nobles to raise troops when necessary, but the English aren't really going to have a standing army like the French and Spanish do. But he controlled his nobles with the court of Star Chamber. He raised money from fees, rents, taxes from lower classes, and those are the things that he didn't have to lean on the nobles so much, and this gave him power. Unification of Spain would give rise to their new monarchy. You have Ferdinand and Isabel, who are from two different areas of France. So their marriage will basically unite these two areas of, no, I said France, I mean Spain, these two areas of Spain. And they establish a professional royal army, which becomes the strongest in the world. They're going to embark on the Reconquista. So they're going to boot out the last of the Muslims, and they will acquire religious uniformity in their area, in the Iberian Peninsula. They use the Inquisition. They get the Inquisition from the Catholic Church, from Rome, and they use it to drive out Jews and Muslims. They conquer Granada, which was the last holdout of the Muslims, and they exiled the Jews. 150,000 of 200,000 Jews are going to leave Spain. And their conquest in the New World gives Spain incredible wealth. Here's Granada, the last stronghold of the Muslims. They're going to boot them out. Here's another. So you have Aragon, you have Castile, these two regions. Ferdinand and Isabella are from these two, and their marriage will pull them together. It's not a clean unification like you would think, but they are working in the same direction. They also acquired these two territories as well. So you basically get Spain as you know it here. All right. Holy Roman Empire. So we haven't talked about really Central Europe here. We get the success of the Habsburgs, which held land in Austria. And they gained power not through war and conquest, but through marriages. Others wage war. You, happy Austrians, marry. A lot of incest going on, but they are marrying their kids off to anybody and everybody that has any kind of power. Maximilian I, he is a Habsburg, and he becomes a Holy Roman Emperor. He marries Mary of Burgundy, who has a son named Philip. And Philip marries Joanna of Castile, which is in Spain. And so their son, Charles, ends up inheriting all, because of these weird, crazy deaths and stuff. It was never meant to happen this way. But he ends up inheriting all three thrones, the throne of Burgundy, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, which is going to cause some problems. It's going to upset the balance of power. The Habsburg family has two different lines. There are the Spanish Habsburgs, and there are the Austrian Habsburgs. Both are very, very, very devout Catholic. Here's some chronology for France. Charles VII, and then Louis XI, the Spider, who is going to, really take firm control of the Estates General. In England, you have the War of the Roses, which will lead to Henry VII taking power from the nobles, taking their armies from them. In Spain, you have a number of events. Isabella of Castile, Ferdinand, who's from Aragon. Their marriage unites these two areas, major, large areas. They use the Inquisition to push out Jews and Muslims, as you can see there. In the Holy Roman Empire, we get Frederick III, and then we get Maximilian I. So you get here some Eastern Europe issues, the Battle of Kosovo, fall of Constantinople, Hungary. This Matthias Corvinus is really good in Hungary, but when he dies, the following is not very good at all. In Russia, you get Ivan III, Ivan Moneybags, who kicks off the power of the Mongols finally and establishes basically a power in Russia. There was a problem of heresy and reform in this time period. A heresy, not something that's new, but two big names you need to know here. John Wycliffe and Lollardy from England. They push for vernacular Bibles. Now, it's important to note that these people come before Martin Luther, but you're going to see that Martin Luther, his ideas stem from these guys here. There's an attack on practices not mentioned in Scripture. The Bible doesn't say anything about a pope. The Bible doesn't say anything about saints and relics and things that the Catholic Church has basically created. And so they attack that. And they say that the Bible is this high authority. Now, John Huss and the Hussites are from Bohemia. And their criticism is of the worldliness and corruption of the Catholic clergy. That they're taking wives and they're having mistresses and illegitimate children. The church invites him to talk with them under a flag of truce, and they promptly ignore their own flag. They torture him and they burn him at the stake. unfortunately for him. So you look at a reform of the church, and you have church councils, the Sacrosancta and the Frequens, but you're still not really going to get there. It's going to take the Reformation to bust up that Catholic Church. Now, popes have gained power over the Catholic Church, but they lost power to the kings. So popes are almost king-like here in this time period, but they don't have as much power as, say, the King of Spain and the King of France, things like that, and King of England. The Renaissance papacies, you had Julius II, the warrior pope, which disgusted many Christians because he spent so much money on wars and palaces and cathedrals and stuff. You had a lot of nepotism going on because you couldn't pass the papacy down to your children. So you're going to hook up nephews, as you can see, and Alexander, the corrupt one, he hooks up his family, the Borgias. Some of the popes are patrons of culture. Leo X, who is a Medici son, he is going to be a massive patron of the arts, and he makes Rome into a new cultural and artistic center. All right, almost done. It's a long one, almost done. There's Pope Leo X, and again, you have some secular issues with these guys. Here's some chronology of the church. Yeah, we're going to burn John Huss. The end of the Great Schism, finally. They get their issues in line. We get back to one pope. Again, some more papacy stuff, some big names you should know here, especially these two guys here. And there's your timeline, which you can study. Again, you can always pause this and take a longer look, which I suggest. And your discussion questions. You need to pause this and be able to answer these questions. If you can answer these questions, then you get it. Okay, that's a long slideshow, and it's going to take you a little bit of time to work through it, but please do so. Thank you for listening, guys, and I will see you in class.